close your eyes and imagine the skies above your city rumbling as hundreds of enemy bombers approach. Now open them. This was daily life for millions of Londoners in 1940. But how did they survive? How did families keep going when every night safety was never guaranteed? Tonight, we explore the forgotten routines, the quiet defiance, and the incredible ways ordinary people held their world together during the Blitz. Welcome back, everyone. Glad to see you again. If you do enjoy these videos, remember to leave a like and comment where you're joining us from. Now take a deep breath, relax, and enjoy this stroll through time. Imagine yourself in the middle of a dark London night, September 7th, 1940. Around 4 p.m, when the air raid sirens first pierced the city's uneasy calm, you'd been hearing about bombers for months, but this was different. Those sirens, the ones people nicknamed Moaning Minnie, weren't just a drill or distant warning this time. They were for you. The skies above began to hum, low at first, then a steady roar as hundreds of engines came closer, louder. That hum soon turned into something terrifying. 348 German bombers, loaded with explosives, accompanied by over 600 fighters. The Blitz wasn't a concept anymore. It was right there, over your head, unleashing chaos. This was the night historians call Black Saturday, when 348 bombers unleashed 2 hours of devastation on London. They didn't just strike random areas. They went straight for the Docklands in the East End, where factories worked overtime and warehouses brimmed with goods critical to the war effort. Lofty targets on paper, sure, but the Docklands was also home to thousands of families, crammed into working-class neighbourhoods. Living cheek by jowl, they depended on that same industry to survive. Most people there barely had much to lose, and yet, on that night, losses came in waves. Imagine, for a second, that hum of engines shifting into explosions, the shattering of windows, flames crackling as entire streets caught fire. Survivors described it as hearing the world unzipping. Reports from that night described families sprinting in every direction, unsure of where to go or what to do. Shelters were the obvious choice, but not everyone trusted them yet. Especially Anderson shelters, those corrugated tin bunkers in people's backyards. The government had offered them for free to people with low incomes, but many weren't properly installed, making them vulnerable to water and debris. Picture this scene. An East End family hears the first bombs hit, the ground shaking like an earthquake. They grab their children, run outside, and wrestle open the door to their shelter. It's damp, water pools in the corners, and cramped, with barely enough room for their small family. But it's their safest option, so they sit and wait, each explosion above sending vibrations through the metal structure. The father holds a gas mask just in case, though the bombs leave no time to wonder if they'll actually need it. Even those lucky enough to make it to large communal shelters didn't find much comfort. Local halls, underground basements, any sturdy public building. These spots filled quickly, most packed so tightly that people had to sit on the floor, knees tucked to their chins. And this was just the beginning. Over the next hours, incendiary bombs rained down like fire from another world. In the Docklands, the flames burned so brightly that they lit up the entire Thames River, which became a beacon for the bombers still circling above. One woman described looking out and seeing a city of fire, the flames licking so high they merged with the night sky. It wasn't just about the destruction, it was the sheer horror of realising how vulnerable London was, even with all the government's supposed preparations. The blackout curtains covering windows, the sandbags stacked outside buildings, none of it could stop the staggering impact of those bombs. In truth, officials had underestimated the scale of an aerial assault like this. They'd spent years planning for possible gas attacks, distributing millions of gas masks, but when buildings were reduced to rubble in seconds, a gas mask was little use. And while thousands of Anderson shelters had been handed out, many people didn't have the space to set them up properly, let alone feel entirely safe inside them. By the end of Black Saturday, the city had paid a grim price. 430 people killed, 1,600 more injured, homes flattened, memories erased in an instant. For London's East End, the losses were devastating. In one night, neighbourhoods were unrecognisable. Yet even here, in the middle of such destruction, there was a strange and stubborn resilience beginning to form. Families stepping out into the chaos of streets full of rubble found neighbours standing with them, disoriented but alive. And that counted for something. Across the city, volunteers and emergency services scrambled to do the impossible, restore some order, any order, to what felt like the end of the world. Fire brigades rushed between flames, often working with equipment damaged in the bombardment. First aid stations were overwhelmed, not just with injuries, but with people caught in sheer panic. Toddlers separated from families, elderly neighbours who'd been pulled from collapsed buildings. By dawn the next morning, Londoners knew this wasn't a one-off. The skies weren't going to stay quiet any longer. For many, survival on that first night came down to luck, where you were standing, where you chose to shelter, but it also depended on the people around you. Bombers could destroy buildings, but they couldn't erase the friendships, the small communities that connected street to street, block to block. Neighbours sharing their family-sized Anderson shelters with another family from next door. Strangers throwing wet blankets over fires to stop them from spreading. The destruction was as indiscriminate as the aid that sprang to life. And so as this grim phase of the war began, it wasn't just a story of houses levelled or dockside warehouses burned. It was also the start of a collective realisation that survival would require adaptation, a new approach to how families lived, worked, and simply made it from one sundown to the next. For the government, it was a wake-up call. Plans that weren't good enough on paper were glaring failures in practice, leading to more pressure to improve air raid defences and support for civilians. And for the people of London, it was proof that their city could burn, but it wouldn't break. But let's not stop there. Survival wasn't just about making it through the first night or putting out the fires. It was about figuring out how to live in a world where the night sky was an enemy, and safety was never guaranteed when the sun went down. What was it like for the families who found themselves huddling in Anderson shelters night after night as the bombs kept falling? For those who didn't just face destruction at a distance but woke up to find their homes in pieces? Let's step into their shoes and see how life in the shelters became a daily reality, and how Londoners face the unthinkable one night at a time. The first thing you notice is the smell. Damp earth, metal, and something faintly sour that you don't want to dwell on too much. You're inside an Anderson shelter, which, let's be clear, is less of a shelter and more of a glorified pit with some corrugated steel bolted over it. Officially, the government handed out over 2 million of these across the UK, each one meant to shield families from bombs and falling debris. Not a bad idea on paper. In reality, though, it's cold, dirty and cramped. You have to crouch just to step inside, and once you're in, there's barely room to sit. Privacy? That's a luxury Anderson shelters don't offer, unless you count the darkness closing in around you. It's pitch black outside now, and the faint outline of your garden has disappeared. Your family, maybe just you, maybe 6 other people, sits shoulder to shoulder on an improvised bench. A thick wool blanket draped over your legs keeps out some of the chill, but the dampness seeps into your bones after a while. Water drips rhythmically from one corner of the shelter, pooling near your feet to warn you the ceiling has sprung a new leak. You listen to it while holding your breath between bomb explosions. Each one shakes the ground beneath you. The walls flex slightly with every tremor, but the structure holds, for now. Some families found ways to keep their Anderson shelters tolerable. A bit of linoleum on the floor, maybe a picture from home pinned to the wall. But for most, there was simply no way to disguise what it was, a last-ditch hiding spot to keep you alive. Sitting here, knees pressed against the person beside you, comfort isn't even an afterthought. For many working-class families, these shelters weren't just uncomfortable, they were barely usable. They were meant to be buried into the ground and covered with earth, which worked well enough in a suburban garden, but not so much in crowded city neighborhoods where space was tight. Some renters didn't even have access to gardens. Those who did often faced flooding when it rained, turning their shelters into glorified mud puddles. And then there's the air. It hangs heavy, stale from everyone breathing the same confined oxygen for hours on end. Anderson shelters don't have much in the way of ventilation. You'd think that surrounded by the cool earth the temperature would balance out, but it always seemed either too cold or sticky with humidity, and there's never a break. Forget about sleeping comfortably here. That rumbling noise above, that's a bomb falling, probably not nearby but close enough that its force is vibrating through your metal cocoon. The tension in the room spikes instantly. No one says a word except one small voice, the mother beside you. She's holding her baby, who's been crying ever since the last siren went off. Her voice is low and soft as she hums a lullaby over the growing noise. Just listen to her, you think. Don't focus on the way the walls quiver every few seconds. Don't imagine what's happening above ground. If you were lucky, and many families weren't, you might have access to a Morrison shelter instead. Picture a steel cage tucked into your living room, doubling as a dining table by day and a makeshift bunker by night. While it didn't offer the sturdy underground cover of an Anderson shelter, a Morrison was supposed to protect you if your house collapsed. Again though, in practice, it was a compromise. A way for city-dwelling families to have some level of protection when digging a hole in the backyard wasn't an option. But in either shelter, the same haunting thoughts lingered. Will it hold? Will this thin layer of steel really keep us safe? The government might have handed out these shelters as a defense against bombs, but they hadn't considered how families would live inside them. No privacy, no room to stretch, and no way to escape the anxiety pressing on everyone like the steel roof itself. But despite all of that, people adapted. You could cry about the situation, or you could lighten the mood, just a little at least. Families found their own ways to survive, not just physically, but mentally. Maybe the kids made up a game, tapping rhythms on the sides of the shelter with rocks or sticks. Or maybe someone cracked a joke, a grim one that shouldn't be funny but somehow is because, well, what else can you do? Children in particular did what they always do. They found ways to look away from the fear outside, to crawl into the small joys they had left. Some would bring toys into the shelter, battered teddy bears with one remaining button eye, wooden cars scuffed from a million races. Others would sing. Maybe it started with just one child humming a tune, which would then spread through the shelter until nearly everyone joined in. Singing in the middle of a bombing raid might seem absurd, but it was cathartic. For a moment, you weren't just hiding. You were part of something bigger than fear. Even adults clutched at scraps of normalcy. A small thermos of tea wrapped tightly in a towel to keep it warm a little longer might get passed around. Some neighbours would bring biscuits, though rationing meant you were always down to the last few. And sure, no one wanted to be stuck inside these shelters night after night. but people often made the best of it. Someone would start a conversation not about the war, not that night, but about simpler things, mundane things like the vegetables they were growing in their garden or memories of a trip to the seaside years ago. These weren't just distractions, they were acts of quiet rebellion against despair. For those in public shelters, though, things could get far worse. If you think an Anderson shelter sounds claustrophobic, imagine huddling shoulder to shoulder with total strangers in a church basement or a town hall, the air filled with sweat and fear. These public spaces often lacked the proper facilities, which meant little ventilation, no toilets, and nowhere to even sit comfortably except the cold, hard floor. Crying babies were a constant backdrop, and tempers flared as people jostled for space. It wasn't just noisy, it was chaos crammed into a single room. Still, even on those darkest nights, these shelters became makeshift communities. You didn't have to like the person next to you, but in that moment, they were your ally, your fellow survivor. Londoners relied on each other, whether it was sharing a cigarette in tense silence or simply making eye contact to acknowledge that yes, this is awful, but we're in it together. And somehow, despite all this, leaking roofs, cramped spaces, endless noise, families found ways to protect what little normalcy they could. Laughter existed here, buried beneath the fear, small joys persisted. And in those small fleeting moments, the terror of the Blitz didn't have the final word. For most, the real battle wasn't against the bombs, it was against the downward pull of hopelessness. And in homes and shelters across London, people fought back each night with the only weapons they had: resilience, community, and sheer stubborn refusal to let fear win. But while the shelters provided refuge for a lucky few, for others, there was no sanctuary. Some emerged the next morning to find their homes reduced to ashes, their lives in pieces. What happens when the walls that are supposed to protect you are gone forever? Let's step into that moment. Waking up to nothing. You wake up to the sound of your neighbour crying out, the word fire carrying down the street like a warning bell, except it's worse than fire. It's chaos. You step outside and realise your home is gone. Not damaged. Gone. The outline of the walls is the only thing left. And even those are reduced to piles of bricks scattered, like a child's forgotten toys. The air smells like smoke mixed with something metallic, and the dust still hasn't settled. It hangs in the light, coating your skin as you step forward, unsure what to do next. A child clings to your arm, possibly your own, possibly someone else's. It's unclear, and in that moment it doesn't matter. There's no plan for what happens now. Losing your home didn't just mean losing a roof over your head. It meant losing everything else that tied you to normal life. Your teapot, your blankets, the photographs you saved for years. They're buried in the wreckage, burned, or simply gone. Some families tried to retrieve what they could. A father might kneel among the rubble, brushing away debris in search of a wedding ring or a watch, while his children clutch each other, wide-eyed, wrapped in the lone blanket that was grabbed on the way out. Even if he finds what he's looking for, it's bittersweet. That heirloom won't rebuild the bedroom it sat in, the memories it represented now tangled up in the lost walls of a house that could never come back. This wasn't an isolated experience. 1 in 6 Londoners lost their homes during the Blitz. Imagine turning a corner and seeing entire rows of houses, blocks of them, flattened. For over 1 million homes, bomb damage varied from small repairs to total annihilation. The impact wasn't just physical, it was deeply personal, cutting into the rhythm of life. These weren't just houses, they were lives stitched together by years of effort. A kitchen where meals were cooked, a bedroom where birthdays were marked, All of it reduced to rubble, sometimes in a single night. And it wasn't limited to homes. Hospitals, schools, libraries, even the iconic Buckingham Palace. Bombs didn't discriminate. The sights were surreal. There are countless stories of people walking past familiar streets only to realise they weren't recognisable anymore. That cafe where you once treated yourself to a cup of tea is just a smoking crater now. Bomb craters lined the streets like scars, and ordinary life was shredded alongside the buildings. The Docklands in particular bore the brunt early on. At one point, fires lit up the night sky so brightly that planes used the flames as guiding markers for further attacks. This was an area where working-class families lived side by side with the factories and warehouses targeted by bombs. When everything collapsed, it wasn't just the city infrastructure that broke, it was the balance of these people's lives. You'd think this level of destruction would have crushed morale. The Germans certainly thought it would. The Blitz wasn't just about targeting London's production capabilities, it was psychological warfare. If people kept waking up to ruins night after night, surely they'd break, right? But the truth is they didn't. It wasn't a stiff upper lip kind of resilience, though. It wasn't glamorous or stoic. It was messy and desperate. The work of people pulling themselves together out of sheer necessity. Because what choice did they have? They still needed to find food, water, and a place to sleep. Tomorrow would come whether they were ready for it or not. When homes were lost, neighbours stepped in. This wasn't optional, it was how people survived. Families would pack themselves into a surviving house down the street, sometimes sharing a single room with 3 or 4 other families. Public buildings became temporary accommodations, churches, town halls, and even tube stations filled to bursting with the displaced. And yet, even in these moments of loss, people found ways to show each other kindness. A neighbour might share their last loaf of bread or offer their only spare mattress to a family left with nothing. These were acts of humanity that kept people going when it felt like everything else was slipping away. One story sticks out. A man sifting through the remnants of his living room, pulling out half-charred photo frames and a child's toy, only to have his neighbours gather around with tea and biscuits. It sounds trivial, doesn't it? Tea and biscuits in the face of total destruction. But these small gestures mattered more than anyone could admit openly. They weren't just about offering comfort. They were about signalling that life wasn't over, that there were still normal human interactions to cling to even when normalcy seemed impossible. The government, of course, had to react to the sheer scale of the crisis. Long-term housing solutions weren't feasible while bombs were still falling, so temporary fixes had to do. Prefabricated huts popped up where possible, offering basic shelter, 4 walls and some semblance of security. Still, for many families, the nights spent homeless and huddled amid the chaos left lasting scars. How do you explain to a child why their bedroom, with its toys and books and safe corners, is now just a memory? The heartbreak wasn't confined to adults. Children bore it too. They'd wander amongst the debris, looking for anything familiar. A doll's arm sticking out from the rubble. A scorched book where the pages couldn't be turned anymore. It was an impossible lesson to teach, that nothing, not even home, is truly permanent. You'd think this level of destruction would have crushed morale. The Germans certainly thought it would. The Blitz wasn't just about targeting London's production capabilities, it was psychological warfare. If people kept waking up to ruins night after night, surely they'd break, right? But the truth is they didn't. It wasn't a stiff upper lip kind of resilience, though. It wasn't glamorous or stoic. It were messy and desperate. The work of people pulling themselves together out of sheer necessity. Because what choice did they have? They still needed to find food, water, and a place to sleep. Tomorrow would come whether they were ready for it or not. When homes were lost, neighbours stepped in. This wasn't optional. It was how people survived. Families would pack themselves into a surviving house down the street, sometimes sharing a single room with 3 or 4 other families. Public buildings became temporary accommodations. Churches, town halls, and even tube stations filled to bursting with the displaced. And yet, even in these moments of loss, people found ways to show each other kindness. A neighbour might share their last loaf of bread or offer their only spare mattress to a family left with nothing. These were acts of humanity that kept people going when it felt like everything else was slipping away. One story sticks out. A man sifting through the remnants of his living room, pulling out half-charred photo frames and a child's toy, only to have his neighbours gather around with tea and biscuits. It sounds trivial, doesn't it? Tea and biscuits in the face of total destruction. But these small gestures mattered more than anyone could admit openly. They weren't just about offering comfort. They were about signalling that life wasn't over, that there were still normal human interactions to cling to even when normalcy seemed impossible. The government, of course, had to react to the sheer scale of the crisis. Long-term housing solutions weren't feasible while bombs were still falling, so temporary fixes had to do. Prefabricated huts popped up where possible, offering basic shelter, 4 walls and some semblance of security. Still, for many families, the nights spent homeless and huddled amid the chaos left lasting scars. How do you explain to a child why their bedroom, with its toys and books and safe corners, is now just a memory? The heartbreak wasn't confined to adults. Children bore it too. They'd wander amongst the debris, looking for anything familiar, a doll's arm sticking out from the rubble, a scorched book where the pages couldn't be turned anymore. It was an impossible lesson to teach, that nothing, not even home, is truly permanent. There's a famous phrase that emerged during this time: business as usual, pinned onto shop window boards or chalked onto walls near destroyed storefronts. It became a rallying cry. It wasn't literal, of course. Half of these businesses weren't anywhere near functional. But the words weren't about the actual act of selling goods or reopening shops. They were about defiance, about pushing forward, however clumsily, as if to say this isn't the end. And for those without homes, that spirit extended too. People didn't just wait for someone else to swoop in and rescue them. Instead, they rebuilt what they could with what they had. Makeshift furniture pieced together from scrap tin salvage to patch leaks in temporary roofs. It wasn't much, but it was survival. The emotional toll cannot be overstated. For many, it wasn't just about losing material possessions. It was about watching decades of a life vanish in one fiery moment. Treasure chests of photographs, keepsakes, heirlooms, all the small things that make a house feel lived in, gone. And yet Londoners kept going. Connections to family, friends, and community became lifelines. People who barely exchanged hellos before the Blitz now found themselves clinging to each other for survival. So what did the morning after look like when you had nothing left? It meant starting from scratch, sharing what you could, leaning on the kindness of neighbours, and rebuilding both physically and emotionally. It wasn't the heroic image perfected in post-war films with neatly dressed survivors calmly sweeping up debris. It was uncertain, and it was full of tears. But it worked. Neighbours helping neighbours built more than just shelters. It built hope amid the wreckage. And the work didn't stop there. Life had to go on, even in the shadow of disaster. Shopkeepers reopened their businesses on bombed-out roads. Workers showed up for jobs that had barely survived the night. Streets filled with rubble became bizarrely familiar sights as Londoners walked to work through the destruction. What made them keep going? What made commerce, something as mundane as buying bread, survive under the falling bombs? That's where we're headed next. Let's check in with the city's workers and shopkeepers, determined to carry on their lives no matter how impossible it seemed. You step out onto the street and the first thing you see is the rubble. It's everywhere. On the pavement, spilling off sidewalks, wedged into the wheel spokes of a cart left abandoned since the last bombing. At first glance, you'd think the entire city had shut down, and why wouldn't it? The shop windows are blown out, many buildings are missing roofs, and if you didn't know better, you'd assume that nothing could resume here. But then you spot something, a phrase written in chalk on a broken-down storefront. Right there, scrawled above the boarded-up display, someone's carefully written 2 words, business as usual. Here's the thing about those 2 words. They weren't just hopeful. They were a declaration. They didn't mean everything was fine. It clearly wasn't, but they meant people refused to fully give in to the chaos spreading around them. And in London, that refusal ran deep. Shopkeepers and workers kept going somehow, even while the bombings ripped their city apart night after night. It wasn't easy, though. Imagine trying to run a shop with half your stock destroyed, or attempting to entice customers who were more concerned about finding shelter than buying bread. For some, reopening their business seemed like an act of wild optimism, so much so that it bordered on defiance. Take this scene, a greengrocer standing outside what used to be his shop. The building's front wall is mostly missing, and the roof is caved in, but he's still set up a small wooden table right out front. On it, a few battered apples and a tin of potatoes. Above the table, he's stuck a sign, open for business. And here's the thing, people show up. Slowly at first, but they do. They shuffle past the shattered glass, stepping over bits of masonry to grab what they need. It wasn't just that they wanted food or supplies. It was also the idea that, in some strange way, life could still go on. This wasn't just about the shopkeepers either. Workers across London made their way to jobs that still existed, in factories, in bakeries, in offices with bomb damage all around them. Many of them arrived later than usual, delayed by rubble blocking the train lines or buses, taking detours around areas still smouldering from last night's air raid. Essential services were only temporarily impaired, and every effort was made to repair public and private buildings quickly to keep things running. In fact, most disruptions lasted only hours before people were back at work, hammering boards over windows or rehanging shattered shop signs as if nothing had happened. The sheer speed at which normal activity resumed was a testament to the determination that seemed stitched into the fabric of the city. Of course, not everyone immediately jumped back into their routines. Fear kept many people inside or in their shelters long after the last raid ended. Could you really blame them? It takes a certain resolve to step out your front door when you've spent the last 12 hours listening to bombs decimate the street next to yours. But for others, the act of returning to work or reopening their shops was a way of taking control no matter how bad things got. It wasn't a big sweeping action, but that's the thing. It didn't need to be. The quiet act of setting out goods on a bombed-out street or handing a loaf of bread to someone covered in dust was defiant in its own right. It said, "We're not done yet." And the impact of all this wasn't just practical, it was psychological. For Londoners who had lost everything the night before, these small signs of normalcy acted as reminders that life hadn't completely unravelled. A chalkboard outside a cafe might announce tea was being served, even if it had to be poured in tin cups instead of fine china. A butcher might hang what little stock he managed to save on a makeshift hook, letting customers know he still had fresh meat. Ration books at the ready. These gestures were more than just commerce. They were threads tying the city together when it felt like it could come apart at any moment. One story comes to mind of a shopkeeper who survived near nightly raids during the height of the Blitz. His shop, every window shattered, and the roof partially caved in, became a local meeting point. He knew many of his customers by name and would set aside small portions of goods, a tin of powdered milk, a packet of sweets, knowing full well they might be needed for a child in the days ahead. Even if his supply chain was crippled and everything came in late, incomplete or damaged, he stayed open. The phrase business as usual became almost a code during these months. It wasn't just written on shops or plastered on public notices. It hung in the air, in people's attitudes, in the way they kept showing up to the places that still managed to function. It echoed in the rhythms of factory workers performing double shifts, each hammer blow or weld a rejection of defeat. Other nations saw London as a city in ruins, its streets lined with broken glass and its people brought to their knees. But through these quiet acts of perseverance, through the sheer determination to keep commerce running, London wasn't just surviving, it was saying something. It was saying it wasn't beaten. The ARP, the Air Raid Precaution Service, played a huge role in supporting this quiet resilience. While bombs fell, these volunteers and workers repaired essential buildings and services almost immediately, often risking their lives to do it. Police officers directed workers through bombed-out streets. Engineers restored gas and electricity under piles of debris, and others cleared away wreckage to keep factories operational. The efforts weren't seamless. They weren't perfect or clean or organised in the way we might imagine today. But the city rarely stopped. Disruptions occurred, sure, but for essential services, they never lasted long. Even so, the long-term challenges were steep. For every shopkeeper patching up their window frame or chalking business as usual on the wall, there was someone whose business hadn't survived, someone who couldn't find the means to reopen. War production remained a priority and many industries had to adapt, relocating factories hit by bombs to different areas or building alternative sites to keep up with demand. The city worked as a machine, grinding and sputtering but never completely breaking. Did these individual acts of resilience, chalking up signs, reopening shops, really boost morale? Absolutely. They weren't token symbols, they were functional. If you could buy bread or tea or an apple even after another devastating night, it was proof that everything hadn't stopped. For workers heading to those bomb-cratered streets, it was a sign that their labour was still needed, that they had a role to play. These weren't grand gestures, but they didn't need to be. They simply reminded people that life could and would continue. And for children who saw these shops reopen or passed workers cleaning rubble from factory gates, it offered something more than just stability. It was a lesson in resilience, a quiet demonstration that even in the face of destruction, there was strength in carrying on. But not every child got to witness this firsthand. For many young ones, the Blitz wasn't just a lesson in resilience. It was a life interrupted, torn apart as they were sent away from everything familiar. What was it like for those children separated from their families during one of London's darkest times? Let's take a closer look at their stories and the impact of long nights spent far from home. It's September 1st, 1939, the day Germany invades Poland. But for you, a child in a crowded London neighbourhood, it's the day your life shifts completely. You're clutching at your mother's hand as a steady stream of children line up around you. Suitcases in one hand, gas masks slung over the other. You've never been more unsure of what's happening. There's no school bell ringing, no smell of dinner at home, no conversation about when Dad might come home from work. Instead, you're about to board a train to a place you've never heard of, waved off by a teary-eyed parent who repeats the same words over and over. It'll be safer this way. It's just for a while. But it wasn't just for a while. For many of the 1.5 million children evacuated during Operation Pied Piper, the largest internal migration in British history, This so-called adventure stretched on for years. While London and other industrial cities braced for German bombing raids, the government's plan to scatter children to the countryside felt like the lesser evil. On paper, it made sense. Remove children from bomb sites, ship them to rural areas where no one would bother to drop explosives, and preserve what might remain of Britain's future. In practice, though, it was messy, emotional, and often heartbreaking. Some of the evacuated kids were barely old enough to read. They stood on train platforms in their best coats, with name tags pinned to their fronts and luggage stuffed with pyjamas and toothbrushes. Many weren't even sure where exactly they were going, just that they wouldn't be home anymore. For younger children, like 5 or 6-year-olds, the separation barely made sense at all. Why did Mum have to stay behind? Why couldn't Dad come too? For all the talk of safety, no one was handing out answers that would make sense to a child. By the time the trains left the station, clanking slowly out of London, fear began to set in. Every stretch of disappearing city pushed these kids further from the only lives they'd known. Where they ended up mattered just as much as the journey itself. For some, the countryside turned out to be like a dream they didn't know they had. Green hills, fresh air, and good food. Things most city kids rarely saw. If they got lucky with their host families, it felt like they'd stepped into a storybook. One boy wrote letters to his mother, describing farm life with awe, even when it came to shoveling hay and milking cows. He'd never smelled grass so fresh or tasted an apple straight from a tree. Host families, if they had the means, would go out of their way to make the children feel welcome. For parents who barely had enough food for their own kids back in London, knowing their evacuees were fed and sheltered provided a fragile sense of relief. But not every story was idyllic. The system had cracks, and children inevitably slipped through them. Yes, some experienced kindness, but others faced rooms that were cold or shared with too many people, hand-me-down clothes that didn't fit, and dinners that left them hungry. The BBC detailed cases of neglect and outright mistreatment. One story tells of a child who became so withdrawn she stopped eating, playing, or even speaking at all. It wasn't that her host family was intentionally cruel, they simply didn't know how to meet the emotional needs of a child plucked from their city home and planted amongst strangers. Even for those who were treated well, homesickness often cast a long shadow over the experience. Particularly for children who hadn't lived in rural areas before, the unfamiliarity was jarring. Farms were oversized and alien, filled with strange noises and strange smells. Imagine leaving a cramped flat in Hackney to suddenly find yourself in a tiny village with nothing but fields in every direction. For city kids who were used to the constant hum of London, the quiet could almost be too much. And they weren't just missing their family and friends, they were missing home, the scent of their mum's cooking, their favourite corner in the schoolyard, even the sound of buses trundling down the street outside their bedroom window. Host families faced their own challenges too. Evacuated children weren't evenly distributed. If a town or village had enough space, it might suddenly find itself hosting dozens or even hundreds of kids. Local schools adjusted to overflowing classrooms. Small towns saw their food supplies stretched even thinner under wartime rationing. These families were doing their bit for the war effort, but not every household felt up to the emotional toll of parenting someone else's child for what ended up being years. And for children unlucky enough to be placed with indifferent or resentful hosts, the emotional toll was even steeper. By January of 1940, it was becoming harder for many evacuees to stay away. For tens of thousands, that meant one thing: heading back. About half of the evacuated children returned to their homes within the first few months of the programme, even before the Blitz turned London into a constant target. Some came back because they couldn't adapt to the countryside lifestyle. Others returned because their parents simply couldn't stand the separation any longer, even if it meant risking their children's safety in the city. Still, for those who stayed, life wasn't entirely bleak. While the letters sent home often spoke of sadness or confusion, there were just as many that captured moments of adventure. Evacuated children were exposed to experiences they never would have had in the city. They grew familiar with wide-open spaces, learned to ride horses and climb trees. Friendships formed between evacuees and local kids, blurring the boundaries between urban and rural life. It wasn't unusual for a city child to form a deep bond with their host family's pets, dogs, cats, even cows, bringing a kind of unforeseen comfort amidst all the anxiety. For some kids, though, it went even deeper than that. A number of evacuees formed such strong relationships with their host families that they stayed in touch for decades after the war was over. While not every rural home replaced their real family, those that did often earned a permanent spot in the hearts of the children they sheltered. Even years later, evacuees would fondly recall hand-knitted scarves, warm dinners by the fire, and small acts of kindness that helped them weather the worst days of separation. So what was it like to be an evacuated child during the Blitz? The truth is, it was complicated. It was terrifying for some, liberating for others. It meant growing up faster than you should have had to. But above all, it was a lesson in uncertainty. You learned how to adapt because you had to. And whether that meant learning to farm alongside strangers, feeling the sting of rejection, or finding unexpected family in unexpected places, one thing's certain: life would never look the same again after returning. For some children, this meant adapting to completely new homes and lives, but for others, those who stayed behind during the Blitz, something even stranger happened. As the bombs fell, they didn't flee underground just for a few hours of safety. Instead, the city itself transformed into a shelter of sorts, one that thousands of people shared day after day. Let's head to the underground and take a look at how London's tube network became a lifeline for so many, from the crowded sleeping platforms to whispered stories in the dark. Picture this: your home is rubble, the local public shelters are overflowing, and you've got nowhere else to hide, so where do you go? Underground. Not metaphorically, literally. London's tube stations became a lifeline during the Blitz. They were cold, cramped, and far from comfortable, but they could do one thing very well: keep people alive when the bombs came down. It started off rocky. In the early stages of the war, the government was against the idea of using the underground for mass sheltering. They were worried it would create what they called a shelter mentality, a fear that people might become too dependent on hiding to be productive citizens. Officials also dreaded the possibility of civil unrest breaking out in such confined spaces. But as the bombing worsened, they couldn't ignore the reality. Londoners needed safe spaces, and they were going to use the tube whether it was approved or not. So by late 1940, the government reluctantly stepped in to manage the chaos, assigning the London Passenger Transport Board, or LPTB, to oversee things. Now, if you've ever ridden the tube during rush hour and thought it was crowded, you've seen nothing compared to what was happening during the Blitz. Families rushed into stations with armfuls of bedding, gas masks, and whatever scraps of food they could scrape together. Platforms and staircases became overwhelmed with a crush of people. The air was heavy with sweat and packed too tightly to circulate well. Parents carried crying babies down narrow stairways while teenage boys jostled for space near the walls. People sat anywhere they could find room, on benches, under stairs, even directly on the tracks, though only in stations where the lines weren't running. One family you can imagine sets up camp on a wooden bench. The father unrolls a thin blanket while his wife empties their bag, pulling out some bread and cheese. Around them are hundreds of strangers, many doing the exact same thing. Children curl up on the concrete floor with makeshift pillows as the night wears on. Overhead, faint vibrations echo down as bombs hit above ground, distant but unmistakable. In those moments, you'd think nobody could feel calm, but eventually, people learn to ignore the rumble. A moment's safety, even in less than sanitary conditions, was better than risking their lives above. Let's not romanticize it, though. Life in the underground wasn't exactly cozy. The tube might have protected people from aerial attacks, but it came with its own challenges. The overcrowding was relentless, and the unsanitary conditions were impossible to ignore. Toilets frequently spilled over with waste faster than they could be emptied. The smell was hard to ignore. Damp clothes mixed with unwashed bodies, and the faint metallic tang of the trains that still ran overhead. Parents tried to shield their children from the grittier realities, but there's only so much you can do when you're living in a public transit station. The government made some efforts to manage this. By the time the tube was officially repurposed as a shelter system, stations started getting basic upgrades. Medical aid posts were set up, staffing trained workers who managed everything from cuts and scrapes to contagious illnesses spreading through the close quarters. Altogether, 86 first aid stations were established, costing around £12,090, roughly $850,000 in today's money. Bunks were another addition, though they didn't appear everywhere. In some of the deeper stations, 24,000 bunks were installed, stretching for a total of 27 miles if you line them all up back to back. Functional, sure. Luxurious? Absolutely not. Still, even in these conditions, the tube stations became more than just survival bunkers. Over time, they evolved into something closer to communities. People didn't just sit silently waiting for the raids to end. They talked, shared stories, and even organised small moments of joy to pass the long, stressful nights. Music was a common escape. Some brought gramophone records to spin songs into the musty air, while buskers wandered from one end of the station to the other, their tunes both a distraction and a kind of fragile reassurance that life hadn't entirely fallen to pieces. And let's not forget the children. Imagine a space like Gloucester Road Station, where part of the platform was eventually set aside as a rudimentary playground. It wasn't much, a loosely defined area to run around in or a few swinging ropes, but it was enough to let kids just feel like kids. In other stations, informal parties popped up every so often. Someone might bring a game or a pack of cards, while others sat back and just enjoyed the rare sight of children laughing during wartime. The tube stations even attracted creative minds. Talk to survivors of the Blitz, and you'll still hear about poetry recitals and impromptu storytelling sessions among crowds of strangers. Late into the night, people would gather around a single speaker, listening intently as a quiet voice told tales meant to fill the gaping silence. In those moments, bombers overhead melted away. People were able to feel human again, despite the circumstances. The underground wasn't just a haven for civilians. On some nights, you'd find nurses weaving through aisles of seated families, checking on anyone who looked unwell, while RP volunteers handed out blankets or guided newcomers to safer spots. The profound sense of shared responsibility became the backbone of life down there. A stranger might offer you half their sandwich. Another might lend an exhausted mother a hand with her toddler. People built connections in the most unexpected ways, held together by the shared experience of waiting out destruction in the dark tunnels beneath London. But, as functional as the underground proved to be, it wasn't a perfect solution. Government officials still fretted about morale. worrying the overcrowding and poor hygiene might spark conflict, or worse, spread disease. And they weren't entirely wrong. There were moments of trouble. Arguments broke out now and then, particularly over stolen spots or supplies. But these incidents rarely escalated into anything more than short-lived spats. It turns out when bombs are falling above, people prioritize sticking together. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the tube stations was the way they reflected the spirit of the Londoners using them. These weren't spaces designed for comfort or permanence, and yet people made them into something meaningful through sheer resilience. The underground wasn't just a place to hide, it became a symbol, proof that no matter how destructive the Blitz became, there was still room for empathy, creativity, and a determination to endure. When dawn broke, families packed up their belongings, shook off the cold, and made their way back above ground. The nights that explosions were stark reminders of what they'd avoided. Emerging from the tube station wasn't just about safety. It was a ritual, a return to living in a city that refused to break, even as it burned. People used the darkness of the underground to survive the war's most terrifying moments, transforming it into more than just a shelter. It wasn't perfect or even close to it, but it worked. And these small acts of perseverance, of surviving together, despite every reason not to, tied directly into something deeper. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about refusing to bow to fear. Whether it was sharing a song or lending someone a hand, Londoners united in quiet acts of defiance every night. What did those everyday acts of rebellion really mean in the context of such destruction? That's where we're heading next. Let's talk about the ways people fought back, not with weapons, but with ordinary everyday life. What does it look like to fight back when bombs are falling from the sky, when your streets are in pieces, and your city feels more battlefield than home? For Londoners during the Blitz, it didn't look like soldiers or tanks. It looked like people going to work, having tea, hanging their laundry, even if all that was left of the line was strung between a few splintered posts in the rubble of their backyard. And while it might sound small, these everyday acts were their own form of defiance, a way of saying you can attack our city, but you can't take who we are. Take a woman in South London standing in what should have been her garden. Maybe it was a Saturday morning, the kind where families would have normally watched neighbours ambling to the market. But now her home is in ruins, and the street barely resembles its former self. Still, with her washing basket balanced on one hip, she carefully pins a white tablecloth to a rope she's tied between two jagged planks of wood. The surrounding rubble doesn't deter her. The sirens, the dust in the air, it all fades away for just a moment. For her, this simple act isn't just about drying a tablecloth. It's about saying life hasn't stopped. That was the Blitz spirit in action. An ordinary kind of resistance built on small but stubborn acts of normalcy. Londoners clung to routine even when chaos was the new normal. Families gathered for meals in whatever corner of their home still stood, savouring over-salted stews scraped together from rationed ingredients. Birthdays were still celebrated in shelters, with candles perched precariously on biscuits instead of cakes. Weddings didn't stop either. Couples tied the knot while air raid sirens wailed in the background, determined to hold on to joy, even if it was fleeting. None of these actions were big dramatic gestures, but that was the point. They were quiet rebellions against the wreckage. What does it look like to fight back when bombs are falling from the sky, when your streets are in pieces, and your city feels more battlefield than home? For Londoners during the Blitz, it didn't look like soldiers or tanks. It looked like people going to work, having tea, hanging their laundry, even if all that was left of the line was strung between a few splintered posts in the rubble of their backyard. And while it might sound small, these everyday acts were their own form of defiance, a way of saying you can attack our city, but you can't take who we are. Take a woman in South London standing in what should have been her garden. Maybe it was a Saturday morning, the kind where families would have normally watched neighbours ambling to the market. But now her home is in ruins, and the street barely resembles its former self. Still, with her washing basket balanced on one hip, she carefully pins a white tablecloth to a rope she's tied between two jagged planks of wood. The surrounding rubble doesn't deter her. The sirens, the dust in the air, it all fades away for just a moment. For her, this simple act isn't just about drying a tablecloth. It's about saying life hasn't stopped. That was the Blitz spirit in action. An ordinary kind of resistance built on small but stubborn acts of normalcy. Londoners clung to routine even when chaos was the new normal. Families gathered for meals in whatever corner of their home still stood, savouring over-salted stews scraped together from rationed ingredients. Birthdays were still celebrated in shelters, with candles perched precariously on biscuits instead of cakes. Weddings didn't stop either. Couples tied the knot while air raid sirens wailed in the background, determined to hold on to joy, even if it was fleeting. None of these actions were big, dramatic gestures, but that was the point. They were quiet rebellions against the wreckage. The government encouraged this perseverance, branding it "keep calm and carry on." You've seen those posters everywhere. At the time, it wasn't just a catchy slogan slapped on tea towels and wall art, it was a strategy. Civilians were urged to maintain routines, even when those routines felt impossible. The auxiliary fire service and women's voluntary services for civil defence became essential to this effort, keeping the city functional while formal systems stretched thin. From handing out blankets and tea to working alongside fire brigades, these volunteers embodied calm efficiency, ensuring London didn't grind to a halt. It also helped that Londoners had symbolic reminders of their resilience, some purely by chance. One of the most striking examples was the image of St. Paul's Cathedral standing tall after a bombing raid. Fire watchers had swarmed the cathedral during the air raid, extinguishing the incendiary devices that could have turned the iconic dome into ash. When photos of St. Paul's wreathed in smoke but still intact circulated through the press, it wasn't just seen as a lucky escape, it became a symbol of the city's survival. The bombers couldn't bring it down, and by extension, they couldn't bring London down either. Of course, staying defiant wasn't always easy. Fear sat heavy on people's shoulders. Families spent every night counting the minutes between explosions, wondering if the next one would finally hit too close. And yet, as the sun rose and the bombers disappeared over the channel, London woke up and carried on. Shopkeepers dusted broken glass from their counters and painted signs outside their shattered storefronts. Business as usual popped up everywhere, simple handwritten notes scrawled onto broken walls or propped up against the remains of windowsills. It wasn't about selling goods. It was a statement, a reminder that life could still happen even amid the destruction. Winston Churchill's voice also cut through the uncertainty. During the Blitz, his speeches became a lifeline for many. He reminded the British people that their fight mattered, framing the bombing campaign not as a tragedy but as a test of their unity and strength. "We shall not fail or falter," he declared in one address, galvanizing millions. His words didn't rewrite the night's devastation, but they gave people something to hold on to when everything else felt fragile. He didn't sugarcoat the destruction or promise easy solutions. Instead, he assured Londoners that perseverance was victory in and of itself. And perhaps just as importantly, he showed up. Images of Churchill visiting bombed-out neighbourhoods, walking among the rubble, and listening to survivors reminded people that they weren't alone in this. Londoners also found their defiance in humour. It may seem strange to think of laughter in the middle of such destruction, but it happened. Families huddling in shelters or tube stations swapped jokes that poked fun at the Luftwaffe, or their endless rations of spam. Others found dark humour in the absurd situations the Blitz often created. Think about it. If everything you owned was already blown to bits, what else could you do but laugh when your last saucepan got crushed in a scrap of falling debris? Humour became a survival tool. It wasn't about dismissing the fear, it was about proving to themselves that they could still feel something other than fear. The BBC also played a role in boosting spirits, but not always in the way you'd expect. During air raids, radio programmes went quiet as the technicians took cover, leaving listeners with ominous dead air. For many Londoners, that eerie silence was the only warning they needed to head to safety. But outside of the bombings, BBC programmes became a steadying presence. That 9 o'clock news bulletin was a ritual, a comfort for families who gathered around their radios to hear what was happening. Even the news of destruction was easier to handle when it came through a trusted, familiar voice. So how did all these quiet acts of defiance affect London's resilience? They painted a picture of a city refusing to collapse under pressure. Every sign that read open for business, every story shared in a tube station, every child playing hopscotch on bomb-scarred streets, it all added up to a collective declaration. You can bomb our city, but our spirit stays intact. Even Hitler underestimated this will. He expected fear and terror would break Britain's resolve, but it had the opposite effect. Instead of dividing people, the Blitz brought them closer, welding communities together in ways no one could predict. The government wasn't blind to this. Propaganda films like London Can Take It played up the stoicism of civilians, carefully crafting an image of resolve that they hoped would ripple far beyond London. It wasn't entirely accurate, of course. People were scared, tempers frayed, entire neighbourhoods disagreed on how to allocate resources or organise defences, but beneath that, the stubborn determination remained. And Londoners held on to it, framing their survival as an act of everyday rebellion. Ultimately, these moments weren't just about morale, they were about identity. The bombings may have stripped people of many things, but they couldn't strip away how Londoners saw themselves. A city of people who stood together, even as their world fell apart around them. Defiance, in this sense, wasn't measured in military victories. It was measured in small human moments. Scattering seeds in scorched gardens, sitting down to tea in dining rooms with half-collapsed walls, laughing at another grim joke. And all of this leaves us with a question. What do these everyday stories tell us about humanity itself? It's not just a story of war. It's a story of what people are capable of when the worst arrives. Let's take a closer look at that. A final exploration of what the Blitz revealed about courage, community, and the quiet strength of ordinary people. The Blitz wasn't just bombs and blackouts, it was a story of quiet strength. Londoners didn't crumble. They adapted. They helped neighbours, shared rations, and strung laundry between shattered walls. Even the phrase business as usual wasn't about survival alone, it was defiance. Hitler's plan to break their morale backfired. Instead, the bombings united people, forging an unshakable sense of purpose and resilience. It's a reminder that humanity endures even when tested to its limits. So what lessons do we take from this? Maybe it's that courage isn't always loud. Often it's as simple as continuing one day, one step, one breath.